Hi, everyone. I'm Eric D'Souza, and joining me today is Donalee Moulton. How are you today?
Good.
Um, you're a little ahead of me, so I appreciate the fact that you're doing this interview so late in the day for yourself. Um, and I appreciate all the work you've been putting into lately for both Crime Races Canada and your own career. So thank you for making time for us today.
Glad to be here.
To everyone else watching, just a little bit about Donalee. Donalee Moulton is an award-winning journalist who tried her hand in short fiction writing for the first time when she wrote and submitted the story Swan Song for consideration for the 40th anniversary of the CWC's anthology, Cold Canadian Crime. She told me in a previous interview that the judges appreciated her unique location and witty writing style. A second set of judges must have agreed with them because she has been nominated for the Crime Writers Canada's Award of Excellence for Best Short Story, sponsored by Mystery Magazine. Donalee, as I said, you and I have talked about it before, and I don't want to ask you the same question. So everyone watching, I'm going to post a link along with this video so you can see that interview, and we'll talk about, or you can go visit that to see a lot of information about your story, Swan Song. Still going to ask you a few questions though, but they're going to be different. Donalee, I often ask authors how they relate to the protagonist, but because we've talked a little bit before, I realized that your own personal experience probably relate a little bit more to the victims, Ira Winter, which is rather unique. So could you tell us basically how her story sort of resembles your own?
When I decided to set the story in a Iqaluit, because it mirrored the theme for the anthology, which was cold, and so it was an easy landing spot for me. And I have spent a lot of time up north, but I am always an outsider coming in to the north. And I didn't want to presume, and nor is there room in a short story to deal with some of the huge and immense issues facing life in Nunavut. So it was easy for me to say, I arrive in Iqaluit as a consultant. I fly in, I spend my time, I fly out. So my victim in the short story is very much doing the same kind of work that I did. She's doing it in a different field than I was doing it, but there are many of us on a daily basis that for months and months of a year will be flying in and out of Iqaluit to do training, to do consulting, to do other kinds of work. So I felt very comfortable with that reality of being in the north.
As you mentioned, it's a little bit of a fish out of water sort of story. In a sense, in this story, it centers around the new police chief, Doug Broomall, who's just taken over this new position. But it must have been quite challenging, just on top of everything of like the new promotion, to go into a completely new community and say, "Hi, I'm your new police chief," and you have that feel towards it. Is it sort of like an easy community to make new friends and assimilate yourself into that, or do they look at you as like an outsider all the time?
In some ways, I was in the ideal position because it was known from the outset that I was going to be transient. Many people take positions up north where they live there for years at a time. And for many of them, they end up coming, as they say up north, they end up coming south after 2, 3, 4, 5 years. I think it's probably safe to say that few actually remain, but the kind of worker that I was up north is the kind that everybody knows I'm only here for 2 weeks and then I go. I may come back in 2 months, but when I come back, I'm still only there for 2 months. So everybody is wonderful and kind, and they make you moose stew, and they take you to see the aurora borealis. But it is like the visiting cousin, right? That you know in a couple of weeks they will go and life will go back to normal. And you enjoyed it while they were there, and everybody was friendly and lovely, but it's not going to have an ultimate impact on your life or theirs.
So obviously this is a hypothetical question, but if Swan Song was a longer song, would a white police chief, new police chief, long-term feel welcome there?
I think one of the commitments that the Nunavut government has made is to hire what they call beneficiaries, to hire people who are Native and Inuit. But that's very difficult. because you can't have somebody clean the airport runway unless they know how to operate the equipment to clean the runway. So this is a community that is very used to having the experts come from the south. So it's not unusual to see them. It's expected to see them. It is expected within the context that someday they will no longer be needed, but unfortunately they've been needed for much longer than has ever been anticipated. So for my police chief, no one would be surprised that it was a white police person from the south, that they were there, that they were training, but that it would not be a surprise if 5 years from now he was still there doing the same job.
One thing, or one genre I enjoyed for myself the most is a good whodunit. But I wouldn't normally think you can do that in such a short space of a short story. I think you did it in 15 pages, and you have the list of characters, you develop them. Is there any secrets that you have to be able to do it in such a small word count?
Well, that's an interesting question. And so the first answer is I'm used to writing to deadline as a freelance journalist. So regardless of what I think the story may warrant, my editor has told me whether this is going to be 800, 1200, 2000 words. And if they want 1500 words, you don't give them 1800 because they're only going to send it back to you to cut. So the crime writers gave us a word count. They said you can't go beyond 5,000. So when you're at 3,500, you'd better be wrapping things up quickly because you're running out of space. So I think that training helped. But I think the other thing that really helped was not having the faintest frig of an idea what I was doing. Right. So this was my first short story. It was not my first short story, but it was my first mystery short story. And you're absolutely right. I've got to introduce this person. I've got to set them in a location. I've got to have the crime, and then I've got to have the suspects for the crime. So all of those people have to be introduced, and it has to be at the same time, one hopes, interesting. Right. So you're doing it and you're thinking, I don't know if this is working, if this is not working, and so I did show it to people. I did get feedback, but it was more chance than deliberation, I think.
You must have had a freeing experience in the last year or so as you decided to write your first full-length novel, which could be whatever word count you want it to be. So
absolutely.
But you did it relatively fast. I'm assuming that you started after we spoke the last time, or has this been a project that you've been working on for a while?
And that's a good question, but you're probably right. I probably had the concept when I was doing this, but hadn't begun the writing part of it. So it came together very quickly. I had read I don't know if it was in one of the discussions on crime writers or if it was in another group, but someone had talked about writing a minimum number a day. So I kind of said, I can do 1,000. And one likes to think that I did. And some days it was wonderful. And days like today, it wasn't. So, but the goal was there, right? So it was my diet and I was going to stick to it. And it really helped me to not lose sight of the goal. The difficult thing about the novel was the reverse of the short story. So the short story was, I could easily go 6,000 words or 6,500 words or 7,000 words. I've got to cut it back. I've got to condense it. With the novel, you're at 35, 40,000 words and you're thinking, whoa, publishers want a minimum of 60 and ideally 70. And I think I'm just about getting to my arc and I'm only in at 35. Because you don't want to pad for the sake of padding, because that seems to detract from what you're trying to do. So that was very new experience to me, not being able to gauge how close I was to the end and whether I was going to hit that elusive 60, 70,000, and admiring the bejesus out of people who are hitting 100,000 and 120,000. And it's like, oh yeah, no.
And that's when you have like 5 points of views and a lot of subplot, and it is doable. I've read quite a few books, though. Let's say they're 100,000, and I wished they were 60,000. It's like there's a lot of padding there. Your story, I heard it through another interview, and you were talking about your lead character, Rael Brava. he sounds like a challenging person to write about, and I'll let you explain how he is. But well, actually, first explain, and then I'll ask you the question.
Okay.
Tell us about Riel.
So as with many main characters in mystery books and novels of any kind, really, there are characteristics that distinguish or define you. And for Riel, he is many things. He is bright, he's intelligent, he's ambitious, he's driven, he's good looking, but he is also a psychopath. And that one defining personality trait colors how he interacts in the world. So while it might look like he is sitting down enjoying a cup of tea, every neuron is firing to say, am I doing this right? Am I fitting in? Do they know I'm different? Because being different gets in the way of his ambition.
My understanding of a psychopath is often, like you said, they don't have to be killers, but they lack empathy. And as a writer, one of our biggest challenges is to make sure that our lead character is likable. So I'm assuming you feel that Riel is likable, but how did you manage to make a psychopath likable?
It's an interesting question. I think I like Riel, but I think what I like are certain characteristics about Riel. What I like about Riel is that he gets up every day and tries his damnedest to fit into a world that he knows he doesn't fit into. He really doesn't give a damn about that world, but he has to survive in that world. And because he wants to do great things in that world, he has to not only survive, he has to thrive. And so I think that that's what I'm hoping that people will see in him. So that this isn't necessarily a character you want to hug, or that you want to invite home for dinner, or that, God forbid, you introduce to mom, right? But this might be a character where you say, okay, man's got guts, right? Man's willing to take a risk. Man's out there every day. And so it's those kinds of, I think he's got redeeming attributes that outweigh the downside of this lack of empathy, this really not giving a damn about the rest of humanity. And he doesn't.
I think I've read before that psychopaths are either serial killers or CEOs. So Riel is is the latter, right?
And it's funny because I haven't watched the show Dexter. My husband does. My husband loves Dexter, but I understand who Dexter is and what Dexter does. And when I came up with this idea one night in my wonderful bath with my aromatherapy, which makes you wonder why you're thinking about psychopaths when you've got candles flickering and, spa music playing, but that's a
Because you're a crime writer.
Yeah. He is one of they've adapted, right? It's like squirrels. They've just been able to thrive in an urban environment, right? And he's been able to thrive and survive and do quite well because he does fall into that 4 to 12% of CEOs who are psychopaths and very good at what they do because they can make hard decisions without letting emotion influence the decision.
I listened to an interview which I found on your website, DonaleeMoulton.com. Is it? Okay, great. Which was a fascinating interview that you did with XFM. So I'm going to borrow a little bit from there because I learned that Hung Out to Dry was not your first choice for titles. And I'm going through the process where finding a title is hard. Like it's really, really hard. How did you come across yours, and what was your one that you had to take out?
My original intent, as I mentioned in that interview, was to try to come up with a title that would lead to a series of titles, right? And I came up with a somewhat profane title. Am I allowed to say it?
Probably.
So I came up with Chunderfuck, which to me was a made-up word, but it was a made-up word that repeated itself throughout the book, and it became a little fun aside. And so what I wanted to be able to do was call the first book Chunder with asterisks for 2 of the letters, and then I would have numbnuts, and then I would have dickwad, and so that would become my A is for alibi or my pub names or something. but I didn't want people to think the book was grittier or darker or more violent than it is, because it's none of those things. So I used a working title with the full intent that when I found a publisher, I would let them know that, no, the book is really called Chunder, right? And my publisher came back and said, yeah, great title, not going to work. You can't use asterisks. So life was very quickly. And then I was where you are, Eric. Then you scramble. Then you think, okay, what do we call it? He works in a cannabis factory. So we went joint, we went blunt, we went all kinds of things that had to do with cannabis. We went things that had to do with hanging, with noose, and somehow over time, Hung Out to Die became the title. And I am growing to like it, but in my heart of hearts, this book is always going to be Chunder.
Let's talk setting a little bit. Your first one wasn't set from where you live, but I believe Hung Out to Dry is. You set it in Halifax this time, where you're born and raised?
Absolutely. Set it in my hometown and set it just outside of the main city of Halifax, without thinking that setting was going to play a major part in this, because it was more about solving the crime than the setting having to do with the solution. But I am surprised at the number of people that have said to me, all Nova Scotians, but the number of people that said to me, oh my God, it's so Nova Scotian. And I'm thinking, really? What about that book? Oh yeah, no, there is the tea thing. Oh yeah, there is the Donalee thing. Oh yeah. And so without realizing it, the stuff you know becomes part of the background of the book unintentionally.
I think also when Crime Writers of Canada, I guess you submitted your story, we got to get to know you, and then we quickly jumped on you and said, would you like to join the board? So how's it been so far?
Absolutely fabulous. And one of the things I've learned is that I get more out of organizations when I'm active in that organization. So nonfiction legal writing was familiar to me. Fiction crime writing was not. And so I am now surrounded by people like yourself with this wealth of experience, with this background. And I am learning by listening. I am learning by being mentored. And I am immersing myself in that world by being engaged. So I would encourage anybody to join, but to join and volunteer.
I'll make this promise to you now that we're recording it. We're definitely going to have to sit down and start working out some sort of panel system or interview system where I can meet some of your writers and we can help promote them a little bit on our channel.
Absolutely.
Last question then, because you told me that you also had, we jumped on you really hard because you also were asked and agreed to become a judge for the Crime Writers of Canada Awards. Obviously not in the category you were nominated for, but in something different. How was that experience?
Oh, look, that was fabulous. I was a judge in the Crime Novel of the Year award. So as I was telling you earlier, that meant reading 46 books. So as daunting as that was, it was also really educational because it enabled me to see the breadth and depth and diversity of the work that's being published by Canadian crime writers. Fiction and nonfiction, and it was absolutely fabulous. At times, you got a little afraid you were never going to get through them all in the allotted time, but we did, and we unanimously agreed on our top picks. So I'm dangling that out there because the short list is out.
Short list is out. I've read 3 out of the 5. I agree with from the ones I've read, brilliant books this year. So I think it was a strong year for Canadian crime writing, and I'm glad you're a part of it. Thank you, Donalee.
Thank you.